Welcome everyone to David Dudley Outdoors, and today we're going to be talking about a bass technique that has been around for a long time, which is the floating worm. Now, when you say floating worm, it's kind of like a general term, but I'm going to get very specific in how to rig a floating worm, where to throw a floating worm, and the best times to use a floating worm. So let's talk a little bit about the history of it. Floating worms have been around forever. Everything from the black and yellow dotted two-hook floating worms to the Davy Height days, the Clark Wendlandt days, back in the Bassmaster days when we seen them catching them on float. Actually, Stanley Mitchell, who was 21 at the time, I remember watching an old Bassmaster video where he was catching them on a floating worm. So this technique has been around for a long time, and like normal, on the professional scene, we do a little tweaks, we do a little things to enhance what we did back then. Plastics have gotten better, and I'm actually going to spill the beans and give you one of the greatest things you could ever do to the floating worm that's probably going to go against everything you know about rigging plastic worms, but it is the must of all must when you're using floating worms. So let's talk about a little bit first off about colors. Typically floating worms are going to be vibrant colors. When I mean by vibrant, you got pink, methylate, you got what they call school bus yellow, you have white, you have disco, and you can use your normal green pumpkins, watermelons, watermelon reds, it doesn't matter, but typically a floating worm is known for vibrant colors, okay? Vibrant colors are what they react to the best versus a darker color, but you can use them, and I will tell you when. And not only are we going to show you in this video, but here in just a few minutes, we're going to actually give you footage in the water of a floating worm to help you visualize what I'm talking about. So we just talked about vibrant colors. Now when it comes to rigging a floating worm, my choice of hook is going to be either a 4 or a 5/0 offset round bend. And the reason I say 4 or 5, because it deals with the weight of the hook, water clarity, and where I want it. So let's talk about a hook. So naturally a 4/0 hook is going to weigh less than a 5/0 hook. We're not using any weights. A floating worm doesn't have a Texas rig sinker on it, nothing. The only weight of the hook is the salt that's in the plastic and the hook that you're using. So a 4/0 is what I'm going to choose when the water is super clear, like really gin clear. I don't really want a 5/0. A 5/0 can, can weight it down, get it down deeper, but a 5/0 is something I'm going to use when the water's got a little bit more stain to it. Clear water, guys, they can see it. They can see it. Seems like miles away, but you know they're not seeing it miles away. But a 4/0 has plenty enough J in it to get a good hook set in them. You don't need a 5/0. They're going to see it and come from long distances. Now, like I mentioned, a 5/0 is going to be something that I use when the water's a little bit muddy, okay? It's it's a little off-centered. I want a little bit bigger hook. It'll sink a little bit faster. I don't have to wait patiently for a 4/0 to bring the worm down to the depths that I desire. Now, you're gonna kind of, when I'm working a floating worm, I want to work it to where it's almost out of my sight, okay? Like you can see it down a long ways, but the higher you keep the worm, the less bites you're going to get. If you can kind of keep that floating worm down to where you're struggling to see it, that is typically where I want to use it. Now, let's talk about the choices of where to throw it. Where I want to throw a floating worm, one great thing about it is, the best thing I love about it is Throwing it around lay down trees. Lay down trees, you're using a weedless Texas worm. You're not using a wacky worm where a hook is exposed. Whether you have a weed guarded or not, it's a hook exposed. You can fire these things up in real bushy laydowns, call them out. They see it. They can see that vibrant color up in laydown trees. You can just use it around grass to cover water. It's something you can use in a lot of thick areas using with the vibrant color. But because it is weedless, you can use it in a lot of places. Let's talk about the setup I like to use for a floating worm. When it comes to using this technique, I'm 100% going to use a spinning rod. When my choice of spinning rod is going to be is a 7'2" medium heavy, which is a 30-ton carbon proficiency rod. These are rods that I actually developed myself. Very strong, very light, and I'm proud of these rods that are going to be coming out here soon. When it comes to choice of line, I like 15-pound Gamma braid attached to, typically, I'm going to start out with 8-pound test fluorocarbon leader. I want that fluorocarbon to sink it. I want it to use that line to help me get it deeper in the depths. Now, you can upscale, guys. You can go to 10-pound test. Say you're fishing extremely shallow water and you don't want your floating worm to go deeper. Guys, you can bulk up with your fluorocarbon, or you can bulk down with going 6-pound test. If you're in ultra clear water, you want to put 6-pound test. It's naturally going to get your worm deeper. They're not going to be as line shy, and you can use that in ultra clear waters. I do not recommend that in muddier waters. All right, guys, when it comes to rigging the floating worm, I'm getting ready to spill the beans, like major beans to you, that is going to help you catch more bass. I guarantee it. And most people don't even know it. They don't even have a clue that they're rigging their floating worm wrong, because there is a right way and a wrong way. So let's talk about that. When rigging a Texas rig worm, typically you're going to come in, pull it out about 1/4 of an inch, turn your hook, punch it straight through the middle, and you're going to see how a floating worm or a Texas rig is straight. That's what you've been taught your whole life, is to have a straight floating worm. So when rigging your floating worm, the correct way is you're going to come in, come out, and you're going to put a big bend in your Texas rig. You do not want it straight. Having a straight worm on a floating worm technique does not give you the efficiency that you need without putting a bend in it. So now that you've seen the rig with a big bend in it, I'm going to also show you what happens when you put a smaller bend in it. So a smaller bend is going to look like this. We're going to come through the same way, pull the worm up, and we're not going to put quite as strong of a bend in it. And the reason is this: when you have a big bend in your floating worm, that worm is going to go side to side very abruptly like this. Now, if I put a slight bend in it, it's going to go whoosh, whoosh. It's not going to go as abruptly. When do I want a big bend in my floating worm? When I'm throwing around targets, when I'm throwing around stumps, a piece of stick, a laydown. I want to be able to work that target around one area for a long time. Now, when I'm covering water with a floating worm, I want to use a bend that's not as aggressive of a bend. Okay, that worm is not going to, it's going to be covering water, but yet still giving it the action that a floating worm needs. Very two different riggings for very two different purposes. And by the way, guys, if you are enjoying this video, make sure to hit the thumbs up button, comment below, and share this video if you enjoyed. I know I always ask you guys, but we truly are spilling the beans to you guys about a technique that can do very well for you in the spring of the year and actually in the fall of the year. I don't really like it much in the summertime time of the year, but spring and fall, these floating worms can be a very good technique. One other important note that you need to know about a floating worm is typically when we tear the front part of our worm, we rip it off, we might bite the first quarter of an inch off of it and then re-Texas rig it, put it back on and throw it out. Well guys, that is a big no-no when it comes to floating worm. As you can see here, you have a blunt nose and you have a cone nose. Well, when you're using the cone nose, that helps drive it back and forth in the water. It's streamlined. It helps with the action of the lure. The more blunt the nose of the worm is, the less action you're going to see. So do not bite off a floating worm, rig it back, and expect it to have the same action. All right, guys, let's head down to my pond, and I'm going to actually show you visually what a big bend looks like, what a slight bend looks like in the water, and what a straight worm looks like in the water. You're going to be amazed at the footage you're about to see. So now we're going to show you exactly what it looks like. Just like that, guys. Oh. The float worm is a deadly, deadly technique. Again, guys, just the main thing whenever you're fishing a floating worm, keep it just barely out of your sight. I don't get much success keeping it far up close to the surface, but if you keep it just out of sight, you can have success just like that.
Where'd it go, Bear? Get it, Bear. Where'd it go?
All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned a lot. It's a very simple technique, and shh, don't tell anybody about the crooked rigging. If you enjoyed this video, hit the thumbs up. Make sure you hit the subscribe button, and make sure you always hit the notification button of what we got coming out. Thank you again, and I'm out.